The auction hall smelled of polished wood and nervous sweat. High windows let in slanted afternoon light that caught motes of dust swirling above the crowd. At the front of the room, on a raised platform, the auctioneer adjusted his glasses, the lenses flashing as they caught the light. His gavel lay waiting on the lectern, its wood worn smooth from years of decisive strikes that had determined fates with a single crack. 7-year-old Ethan Brownlee sat stiffly between his mother and stepfather, his small fingers clutching a blue ceramic piggy bank. The bank was shaped like a cartoon rocket ship, its paint chipped from years of being dropped and cherished in equal measure. Inside, coins and a few crumpled dollar bills shifted with every tremble of the boy's hands. The sound was barely audible beneath the murmur of the crowd, but to Ethan, it was deafening. The last remnants of his allowance, birthday money, and tooth fairy treasures all pooled together in a desperate bid to save the only living piece of his father he had left. Across the room, separated by a sea of tailored suits and department uniforms, Max the Labrador stood at attention beside his handler. The dog's golden coat had faded slightly with age, but he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a veteran. His K9 vest, usually crisp and official, had been removed for the auction, leaving him looking strangely vulnerable. Yet his eyes, warm and intelligent, remained fixed on Ethan with an intensity that made the surrounding adults shift uncomfortably. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Lot 47, he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly through the hall. "Retired K9 Officer Max, 7-year-old male Labrador Retriever, trained in narcotics detection and suspect apprehension, service record available upon request." A murmur ran through the crowd as paddles twitched in anticipation. Opening bid at $2,500. Ethan's breath hitched as the first paddle went up. Then another. And another. The numbers climbed with terrifying speed. $3,000, $3,000, $4,500, $7,000, each one a nail in the coffin of Ethan's hopes. His mother's arm tightened around his shoulders, her perfume mixing with the salt of silent tears. His stepfather sat rigid, jaw clenched, watching the proceedings with an unreadable expression. Max suddenly lunged forward, his leash snapping taut. A low whine built in his throat as he strained toward Ethan, his paws scrambling against the polished floor. The handler yanked him back with a sharp command, but the damage was done. Every eye in the room had seen the undeniable connection between boy and dog. For a brief, electric moment, the auction hall held its breath. Then, the bidding resumed. At $15,000, Ethan began counting his money again, his small fingers arranging coins into careful stacks on his knees. A quarter, 3 dimes, 5 pennies. The numbers didn't come close to matching what the adults were calling out, but he kept counting anyway, as if sheer determination could bridge the impossible gap. At $25,000, a well-dressed man near the front, James Blackwell, owner of a private security firm, raised his paddle with a confident flick of the wrist. His tailored suit probably cost more than Ethan's entire savings. His expression never changed as the numbers climbed higher, his bids coming fast and firm, like a general commanding troops. At $35,000, Ethan's hands stilled. His piggy bank held $35,000. Ethan. The reality of the situation settled over him like a physical weight. His eyes burned, but he refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of all these people who saw Max as just another asset to be traded. Then, from the back of the room, a new voice called out, $40,000. The crowd turned as one. Steve Wells, a reclusive local farmer, stood leaning against the rear wall. His flannel shirt and worn jeans stood out among the suits, his face weathered from years of outdoor work. He didn't hold a bidding paddle, just raised his hand in a gesture that brooked no argument. Blackwell's head snapped around. The two men locked eyes across the room, some unspoken challenge passing between them. The auctioneer hesitated, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Ethan barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to Max, who stood quivering with tension, his tail giving the barest wag as the boy met his gaze. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the money, not the crowd, not even the gavel. hovering above the auction block. The Labrador's ears perked forward, his nose twitched. And as Ethan unconsciously reached for the sheriff's badge hanging around his neck, his father's badge, Max let out a single, sharp bark that echoed through the suddenly silent hall. The patrol car's headlights cut through the pre-dawn darkness like twin sabers, illuminating the winding backroads of Weld County. Inside the cruiser, Deputy Samuel Brownlee hummed along to the staticky country station, his calloused fingers drumming the steering wheel in time with the music. In the back seat, Max rested his chin on the metal partition, his warm breath fogging the plexiglass with each contented exhale. The Labrador's golden fur caught the glow of dashboard lights, giving him an almost ethereal halo as he watched the landscape blur past. Samuel reached back without looking, his hand finding the familiar spot behind Max's ears. The dog leaned into the touch, his tail thumping against the seat. They'd been running this route together for nearly 8 years, long enough for every scratch on the cruiser's interior, every worn patch on the seats, to tell its own story. The coffee stain from when Max had startled at his first gunshot, the claw marks near the door where a trapped raccoon had made its displeasure known. The faint indentation in the headrest where Samuel always rested his arm during those long night shifts. Their partnership had begun the day Max graduated from K9 training. Samuel had been skeptical at first. He'd expected a German shepherd, not this grinning Labrador with ears like velvet flaps. But within weeks, Max had proven himself. His nose could find drugs hidden in engine blocks, his calm demeanor could coax terrified children from hiding places, and his unshakable loyalty had saved Samuel's life more than once. The department called them Golden Boy and Sunshine. Samuel with his serious demeanor, and Max with his perpetually wagging tail. At home, the dynamic shifted. The moment Samuel pulled into the driveway, Max transformed from disciplined officer to overgrown puppy, barreling toward the front door where 3-year-old Ethan would be waiting, his overalls perpetually stained with grass and finger paint. The boy would shriek with laughter as Max licked his face, their reunion ritual as predictable as the sunrise. Margaret often joked that Max had 2 sets of training, one for police work, one for toddler wrangling. He'd patiently endure tea parties where Ethan served imaginary cookies on paper plates, his tail sweeping the floor as he ate, each offering with exaggerated gusto. During nap time, the dog would curl around the boy like a living blanket, one ear cocked for any threat. And when Samuel returned from late shifts, he'd often find them like that. Ethan's small fingers tangled in golden fur, Max's nose tucked protectively over the child's shoulder dot. The memories came in flashes now. Max splashing through the creek behind their house, Ethan clinging to his collar like a miniature cowboy riding a golden steed, Samuel teaching the boy how to brush the dog's coat, always with the grain buddy, while Max licked peanut butter from a spoon in Ethan's other hand, Dot the way the Labrador would position himself between Ethan and strangers at the park, not aggressive but alert, his body a living barrier. Stormy nights when thunder rattled the windows, and Max would clamber onto Ethan's bed without invitation, his solid weight a comfort against the boy's trembling back. They'd been a perfect unit, the 3 of them. Samuel's steady presence, Max's boundless devotion, Ethan's bright laughter weaving them together. Even after Richard entered the picture 2 years after Samuel's death, the shadow of that harmony remained in the way. Ethan's eyes still sought Max first when he entered a room, in the quiet understanding that passed between boy and dog without words. The cruiser's back seat held other memories too, less warm, but no less vital. The time Max had sniffed out a meth lab hidden behind a false wall in a seemingly abandoned barn. The missing hiker they'd found hypothermic but alive, thanks to Max's relentless tracking through freezing rain. The armed robber who'd surrendered immediately upon seeing a 90-pound Labrador barreling toward him, all teeth and thunderous barks. Samuel used to say Max had 3 settings: work mode, family mode, and food mode. The transitions between them were instantaneous. One second he'd be sniffing luggage at a traffic stop with single-minded intensity. The next he'd be rolling in grass with Ethan, his tongue lolling in canine bliss. Their last normal morning played like a film reel in Margaret's mind. Samuel kneeling to tie Ethan's shoes, while Max waited by the door, leash in mouth. The way her husband had paused to press his forehead against the dog's, some silent communication passing between them. "Take care of them," he'd murmured, though at the time it had just seemed like another ordinary goodbye. Now, those memories were artifacts in a museum Ethan couldn't bear to visit. The boy had stopped asking about his father shortly after the funeral, though Margaret sometimes caught him whispering to Max late at night, his small hands buried in golden fur as if digging for answers. The dog always listened, his brown eyes reflecting the nightlight's glow like twin pools of liquid amber.
Days sighed in. In the years since Samuel's death, Max had aged. White flecked his muzzle, and he moved with the careful precision of a body that remembered every chase, every jump, every impact. But when Ethan entered the room, the years fell away. His tail would wag with the same vigor as when he'd been a pup, his eyes bright with undimmed devotion. The department's kennel master had noted it in his reports, how Max, who'd grown increasingly withdrawn around other handlers, would still snap to attention when Ethan visited, responding to the boy's whispered commands with military precision. The other officers called it a miracle. Margaret knew better. It wasn't training, it was love. And now in the auction hall with bids climbing higher and Ethan's Piggy bank holding less than $25, that love hung in the balance. The gavel hovered. The auctioneer's lips parted. Somewhere a clock ticked toward the moment that would sever the last living thread between a boy and his father's legacy. Max whined again, the sound cutting through the murmuring crowd like a knife, his ears flattened against his skull, his entire body trembling with the effort of staying put. The handler's grip on the leash tightened, but everyone could see the truth. This dog had already chosen. His place wasn't with the highest bidder. It was with the small, silent boy whose tears made dark spots on the knees of his jeans as he counted out coins that would never be enough. Rain fell in silver needles against the cruiser's windshield, the wipers struggling to keep pace. Deputy Samuel Brownlee squinted through the storm, his knuckles whitening on the steering wheel as the radio crackled with static, laced urgency. In the back, Max stood braced against the partition, his claws clicking against the hard plastic floor with each turn. The Labrador's ears were pinned back, his nostrils flaring at the scent of gasoline and wet asphalt that seeped through the vents. The suspect's truck weaved ahead, taillights smearing red across the darkness like fresh blood. Samuel had been tailing it for 11 miles, close enough to see the driver's panicked glances in the rearview. A routine traffic stop had escalated when the truck bolted, and now they were hurtling toward the county line at speeds that made the cruiser shudder. Max whined, low and steady, a sound Samuel had learned to heed. The dog's muscles were coiled, his weight shifted forward in anticipation. Some handlers claimed their K9s could sense danger before it happened. Samuel had scoffed at the idea until the night Max refused to enter a meth lab moments before the explosion. Now he trusted that instinct implicitly. A curve loomed. The truck's brakes screamed. Samuel had half a second to register the glint of metal. A guardrail ripped open like a tin can before impact. The world upended. Metal shrieked. Glass erupted in glittering shards. The cruiser barrel rolled twice before slamming roof first into a ditch. The impact driving the breath from Samuel's lungs. For 3 heartbeats, there was only silence and the drumming rain. Then pain, bright and electric, spiderwebbed through his ribs. Blood trickled into his left eye, warm and thick. In the back, Max scrabbled against upturned seats, his claws scrambling for purchase. A gash above his brow dripped crimson onto his golden fur. But he was alive. Samuel could hear the dog's frantic panting over the hiss of the ruin and yen. The partition had held, though its metal frame was bent like a crumpled soda can. "Max!" Samuel choked out. His right arm wouldn't respond. Hey, boy." The Labrador's whine cut through the ringing in Samuel's ears. The dog was trying to nose through the gap in the partition, his body trembling with the effort. Beyond the shattered windshield, headlights appeared, the suspect doubling back. Samuel's service pistol lay somewhere in the footwell, just out of reach. Footsteps splashed through mud. A shadow blocked the light. Max erupted into furious barks, his voice raw with warning. The suspect hesitated, then raised a shotgun. Samuel's body moved before his mind could catch up. He twisted, throwing himself toward the backseat just as the blast tore through the cruiser's remains. Pellets shredded the headrest where his skull had been. The second shot never came. Distant sirens wailed. The suspect fled, his footsteps fading into the storm. Samuel slumped against the seats, his vision tunneling. Max had gone silent, his nose pressed to the gap in the partition, breathing in sync with his handler's ragged gasps. The dog's warmth was the only thing keeping Samuel conscious as the ditch filled with icy water. "Stay," Samuel whispered. His fingers brushed Max's wet fur. "Good boy." The paramedics found them like that an eternity later. Samuel half submerged, his hand still tangled in Max's collar, the dog's body curled protectively over his chest. They had to pry Max away to load Samuel into the ambulance. The Labrador fought them, his barks hoarse with panic, until a young deputy promised, "He's coming with you." But Samuel never woke up. The hospital corridor was too bright, the fluorescence bleaching the color from Margaret's face as the doctor spoke. Ethan, clutching a stuffed dinosaur, didn't understand why Mommy was crying. Max, bandaged and limping, licked the boy's salty cheeks until his own fur was damp. That night, while Margaret made phone calls and Richard hovered awkwardly with casseroles, Ethan crawled into Max's dog bed. The Labrador encircled him, his body a living wall against the world. The boy's whispers were barely audible. "Where's Daddy?" Max licked his hair. It wasn't an answer, but it was enough. Days blurred. The funeral was a sea of navy uniforms and polished boots. Max sat at attention beside Ethan's chair, his ears twitching at every sob, every muffled cough. When the 21-gun salute shattered the silence, the Labrador didn't flinch, but Ethan did, his small hands flying to his ears. Max immediately nudged his way onto the boy's lap, his weight a grounding force. Afterward, the department offered to retire Max early. "He's earned it," the sheriff said, scratching behind the dog's ears. Margaret declined. Max needed purpose, and Ethan needed him. But grief reshaped them both. Max, once vibrant at work, moved through his duties like a ghost. He still performed flawlessly. Nose down, ears up. Every command obeyed. But the spark was gone. His kennel mates noticed. They gave him space, their usual playfulness muted around him. Ethan stopped speaking. At first, it was just to strangers, then to teachers, then to everyone, except Margaret. And even those words came in whispers. By the time Dr. Winters put a name to it, selective mutism, the boy hadn't spoken aloud in 7 months, except to Max. During their supervised visits at the K9 facility, Ethan would press his forehead to the Labrador's and whisper secrets no one else could hear. Max always listened, his tail thumping softly against the floor. The handlers noted it in their logs. Subject. Shows. Marked. Improvement. In mood and responsiveness during minors' visits. Recommending increased access. But policy was policy. Max wasn't theirs anymore. He belonged to the department, and departments didn't account for broken hearts. The auction notice arrived on a Tuesday. The envelope arrived with the morning mail, its crisp white stark against the pile of coupons and condolence cards that still trickled in 3 years after Samuel's death. Margaret Brownlee almost missed it between the electric bill and a supermarket circular, her fingers numb from another sleepless night. The sheriff's department logo in the upper left corner made her coffee turn to acid in her throat. The paper inside smelled of toner and bureaucracy. Policy 5143, stamped with Chief Dawson's signature, announced Max's official retirement date and the auction details in bullet-pointed efficiency. Words like asset liquidation and liability transfer blurred together as Margaret's vision tunneled. At the bottom, a handwritten note. Per county regulations. No exceptions. MD. The refrigerator hummed in the sudden silence. Across the kitchen, Ethan sat methodically dissecting a waffle into geometric shapes, syrup pooling between the squares. Max lay at his feet, chin resting on the boy's sneaker, as he had every morning since Samuel's death. The Labrador's tail thumped once when he noticed Margaret staring, his eyebrows twitching in that expressive way dogs have when they sense distress. She folded the memo twice, pressing the creases sharp enough to hurt, and tucked it into her apron pocket before Ethan could see. The paper burned against her thigh all morning as she moved through chores with robotic precision, loading the dishwasher, scrubbing counters already clean, rearranging the junk drawer 3 times. At 10:37 a.m., when Richard left for work with a perfunctory peck on her cheek and Ethan retreated to his Lego fortress in the living room, Margaret locked herself in the bathroom. The memo unfolded itself like a living thing in her shaking hands. March 15th, Annual Fallen Officers Benefit Auction. Proceeds to support families of deceased personnel. The irony tasted like bile. They would sell Max to help families like theirs, while destroying what remained of her son's fragile peace. Through the door, she heard the familiar rhythm of Ethan's quiet play. The click of plastic bricks, the occasional whispered instruction to Max, who served as both audience and construction assistant. Margaret pressed her forehead against the cool mirror. The woman staring back had aged a decade in 3 years. Shadows pooled beneath her eyes, and new streaks of gray threaded through hair she hadn't had time to color. Samuel's badge, which she still carried in her pocket out of habit, left a circular imprint on her thigh through the fabric. Downstairs, a crash startled her upright. She found Ethan frozen amid scattered Legos, his breath coming in short gasps as he stared at the toppled tower. Max was already there, nudging the boy's clenched fists with his nose until the fingers uncurled. No scolding came. Ethan hadn't spoken above a whisper since the funeral, let alone shouted in frustration. His tantrums were silent, devastating things that left him trembling and exhausted. Margaret knelt to help gather the pieces. Her knee came down on a stray brick, the pain sharp and sudden. Something about that physical jolt broke the dam. Hot tears splashed onto the plastic shards as she clutched them too tight, the edges biting into her palms. Max abandoned Ethan to press against her side, his whole body vibrating with concern. The dog smelled like sunshine, and the faintest trace of Samuel's aftershave still lingering on his old blanket. Margaret buried her face in his fur, inhaling the scent of the life they'd lost. When she finally looked up, Ethan was watching with those old soul eyes that saw too much. He reached out, not for her but for Max, his small fingers threading through golden fur like it was the only real thing in the world. The message was clear. This was the line they couldn't cross. Max was the last tether to the before times, to breakfast with pancake mustaches and bedtime stories read in Samuel's baritone. That night, after Richard's snores filled the bedroom and Ethan's nightlight cast dinosaur shadows across his walls, Margaret crept to the living room with her laptop. The screen's blue glow illuminated research tabs, K9 adoption laws, liability waivers, precedent cases. Every search led to the same dead end. Police dogs were considered equipment, not pets. The department could dispose of them as they saw fit. At 2:17 a.m., she found the loophole, a 2009 case in neighboring Larimer County, where a retired narcotics dog was allowed to stay with his handler's widow after public outcry. The key had been framing it as a continuation of service, the dog providing therapeutic support to the officer's children. Margaret's fingers flew across the keyboard, drafting an email to Dr. Winters. The psychiatrist responded within minutes despite the hour, attaching scanned letters of recommendation and pages of clinical studies about animal-assisted therapy for childhood trauma. Her final line stuck like a burr. Separating them would be medically detrimental. I'll testify if needed. Dawn found Margaret surrounded by paperwork, her spine stiff from hours hunched over coffee-stained printouts. Somewhere in the night, Max had abandoned his post at Ethan's door to curl around her feet, his warmth a constant through the darkest hours. She scratched behind his ears, feeling the raised scar from the crash. "You're coming home," she whispered. The dog's tail thumped once in the quiet, but the universe had other plans. Richard discovered the paperwork spread across the kitchen table when he came down for breakfast. His lips pressed into that thin line she'd come to dread as he scanned Dr. Winters's letter. "You're really going through with this?" He kept his voice low, but each word landed like a stone. "That dog belongs to the county, Maggie. You can't just—" "He belongs to Ethan." Margaret slammed the cabinet door hard enough to rattle the dishes. The sound woke Max, who lifted his head with a concerned whine. Richard's sigh carried the weight of arguments they'd had 100 times before. "It's been 3 years. When do we move on? When does Ethan start living in the present instead of—" A creak on the stairs silenced them. Ethan stood frozen halfway down, his dinosaur pajamas pooling around 2 thin ankles. His gaze darted between them before settling on Max, who was already crossing the room to nudge the boy's hand. Margaret watched as Ethan's fingers automatically buried themselves in golden fur, his breathing slowing to match the dog's steady rhythm. No words passed between them. None were needed. The way Max leaned into the touch, the way Ethan's shoulders relaxed. It was a language older than speech, one grief hadn't stolen from them. Richard saw it too. Something in his face shifted as he took in the scene, his coffee cup hovering forgotten mid-air. For a fleeting moment, Margaret thought he might finally understand. Then his phone buzzed with a work alert, the spell broken. Richard drained his coffee in one gulp and grabbed his briefcase. "We'll talk tonight," he said. But the set of his jaw suggested the conversation was already over. The front door clicked shut. Ethan retreated back upstairs with Max at his heels, leaving Margaret alone with her paperwork and the unshakable certainty that this battle would cost more than she'd imagined. At 9 a.m. sharp, she dialed the sheriff's department. Chief Dawson's secretary put her on hold for 12 minutes before transferring her to voicemail. The second call went straight to the automated system. By the third attempt, her fingernails were leaving crescent moons in her palms. When Dawson finally picked up on the fourth try, his sigh crackled through the receiver. "Margaret, I figured I'd be hearing from you." She launched into her prepared argument. "Doctor, Winter's recommendations, the Larimer County precedent, Ethan's progress." The line stayed silent so long, she thought they'd been disconnected. "Policy's policy," Dawson said at last. "We got burned bad on that last retirement placement. Dog bit a kid, cost the county 6 figures in lawsuits." His chair creaked as he leaned back. "Look, I loved Sam like a brother, but I can't make exceptions, not even for his boy." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "Then sell him to me. Name the price." A humorless chuckle. "You know how much a trained K9 goes for at auction? 15, 20 grand easy. Blackwell's already sniffing around. And that Farmer Wells?" The rest faded into white noise. Margaret stared at the memo still lying on the counter, the date circled in red now, March 15th, 6 weeks away. Time enough to rally the community, to beg and borrow and sell whatever it took. Her reflection in the microwave door showed a woman with nothing left to lose. Max's tags jingled upstairs where he guarded Ethan's latest nightmare. Somewhere in the house, Samuel's old uniform still hung in the back of their closet, the fabric still holding his shape. Margaret opened her laptop to a fresh page. The GoFundMe title came easily. "Help bring Deputy Brownlee's partner home." She uploaded the last photo they'd all taken together. Samuel grinning in his dress blues, one hand on Max's head, the other around Ethan's shoulders. The boy was mid-laugh, his face alight with joy. Her finger hovered over the publish button. In the quiet house, Max's nails clicked down the hallway toward her, his presence a silent question. Margaret reached down without looking, her fingers finding the familiar spot between his ears that Samuel used to scratch. "Hold on a little longer," she whispered. The screen's glow reflected in the dog's watchful eyes as the page went live. The church basement smelled of burnt coffee and lemon-scented disinfectant, the kind of artificial cleanliness that clung to institutional spaces. Folding chairs formed a lopsided circle, where Margaret stood clutching a stack of flyers, her knuckles blanching against the paper. The words, "Save Max," screamed in bold letters above a photo of Ethan with his arms around the Labrador, the boy's face pressed into golden fur. 23 people had come. Not the overflowing crowd she'd imagined when planning this meeting, but enough to fill the room with nervous energy. Retired Officer Ruiz leaned against the snack table, his prosthetic leg clicking against the linoleum. Miss Henderson from Ethan's school fiddled with her hearing aid. A cluster of police wives whispered near the radiator, their husbands conspicuously absent. Margaret smoothed the flyer against her thigh. The ink left smudges on her skin like bruises. "The auction is in 19 days, she began, then stopped when her voice cracked. Max, lying at her feet, nudged her ankle with his wet nose. The dog's warmth grounded her as she started again. "They value Max at $15,000. We've raised $3,200. A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Kowalski from the bakery stood abruptly, her chair screeching. "I'll organize a bake sale. My cinnamon rolls—" "Need health department permits," interrupted a man in the back. James Blackwell's security firm logo gleamed on his polo shirt, the embroidered panther seeming to snarl as he shifted. "Public fundraising on county property requires approval, which you don't have," the radiator hissed. Margaret's pulse throbbed in her temples as Blackwell smiled, the expression not reaching his cold gray eyes. He'd been appearing like this for days, at the grocery store when she bought poster board, outside Ethan's school during pickup. Always watching, always smiling. Max rose to his feet, his shoulder pressing against Margaret's knee. The dog didn't growl, but every muscle in his body had gone rigid. "We're on private church property," Reverend Cole said mildly, stepping between them. His clerical collar seemed to glow in the fluorescent lights, and I believe we were discussing cinnamon rolls. The tension broke into scattered laughter. Blackwell's smile tightened before he turned on his heel and left, the door swinging shut behind him with a sound like a gunshot. That night, Margaret sat at the kitchen table counting donations. Mostly 5s and 1s, a few wrinkled 20s. The numbers wouldn't add up no matter how many times she ran the calculator. Through the window, Richard's silhouette moved in the garage, his phone pressed to his ear. He'd been taking more calls out there lately, his voice too low to hear but his posture all defensive angles. Upstairs, water ran in the bathroom where Ethan was supposed to be brushing his teeth. Margaret found him sitting fully clothed in the empty tub instead, his arms wrapped around Max's neck. The dog licked at the boy's cheeks, his tongue swiping away tear tracks Margaret hadn't known were there. She knelt beside them, the tiles cold through her jeans. Ethan's breath hitched as she touched his back, his ribs sharp beneath his pajama top. 3 years of grief had hollowed him out, leaving only this fragile shell held together by golden fur and whispered secrets. Max watched her over the boy's shoulder, his eyes reflecting the nightlight in twin pools of amber. The garage door slammed. Richard's footsteps climbed the stairs, paused outside the bathroom, then retreated to their bedroom. The unspoken accusation hung in the air. This isn't normal. This isn't healthy. But Margaret couldn't bring herself to care. Normal had died with Samuel. At 3:17 a.m., she woke to Max's low growl. The dog stood at the bedroom window, his ears pricked toward the backyard. Margaret peered through the blinds but saw only darkness, until the motion-activated floodlight flicked on, illuminating Blackwell's hulking form near the shed. He wasn't doing anything illegal, just standing there smoking a cigar, the glowing tip bobbing like a firefly as he stared up at the house. Max's growl deepened into a vibration Margaret felt through the floorboards. She reached for her phone, then stopped. Calling the police would mean talking to Dawson, and Dawson had made his position clear. The next morning, she found the GoFundMe vandalized. Someone had reported it for misrepresentation, freezing the funds. The bakery permit was denied due to oven safety concerns. Even the car wash fundraiser got rained out, the storm clouds rolling in with suspicious timing. Margaret stood in the downpour, watching teenagers dismantle the soapy tables, her sneakers soaked through. Across the parking lot, Blackwell sat in his idling SUV, the windshield wipers slicing back and forth like a metronome counting down her failure. That's when Steve Wells appeared beside her, holding an umbrella over them both. Up close, the farmer smelled of hay and honest sweat. His flannel sleeves rolled to reveal forearms mapped with scars. "He's trying to scare you," Wells said, nodding toward Blackwell's car. Rain dripped from Margaret's nose. "It's working." Wells reached into his jacket and produced a business card for a Denver law firm. These folks handle whistleblower cases. They're interested in Max's specialized training. His calloused thumb brushed the embossed lettering. "But that's a conversation for drier weather." Blackwell's engine revved as they walked away together, the sound swallowed by thunder. Max pressed close to Margaret's side, his fur shedding water in golden streams. The dog's body heat cut through the chill, a living reminder. This fight wasn't over yet. Back home, Richard was waiting with divorce papers spread across the kitchen table. He didn't look up from his laptop as Margaret dripped onto the tiles. "I've been offered a position with Elite Security," he said to the screen. "Blackwell's company. They need someone with law enforcement connections." The words landed like punches. Max positioned himself between them, his tail stiff. Richard finally met her eyes. "It's a fresh start, Maggie, for all of us." He gestured to the paperwork. "Full custody stays with you. I'm not a monster, but the dog goes." Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle. Somewhere beneath the patter, Ethan's footsteps creaked on the stairs. Listening. Always listening. Margaret studied the man she'd married 2 years after Samuel's death, searching for some remnant of kindness beneath the stranger's face. Max's wet fur stuck to her fingers as she scratched his ears. The dog leaned into the touch, his weight solid and real against her leg. Richard's ultimatum hung between them, but Margaret had already made her choice years ago. The moment she'd watched Samuel's cruiser pull away for the last time, unaware that her real vows were just beginning. She left the papers on the table and walked upstairs to Ethan's room. The boy sat cross-legged on his bed, his father's badge polished to a shine in his lap. Max bounded up to join him, shaking water everywhere. Margaret knelt beside the bed, her knees popping. She didn't speak, just pressed her forehead to Ethan's, the way Samuel used to when words failed. The badge's metal edge bit into her palm as she squeezed it tight, its ridges leaving marks she knew would linger. Downstairs, the front door clicked shut. Richard's car started with a purr, then faded down the street. The house settled into a new kind of silence, lighter somehow, despite the storm still brewing outside. Margaret exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. They were on their own now, and they were going to war. Dawn bled across the parking lot in streaks of orange and gray as Margaret guided the minivan into a space marked visitor. The county administration building loomed ahead, its glass doors reflecting the storm clouds that had followed them from home. In the back seat, Ethan clutched his blue piggy bank with both hands, his knuckles pale against the ceramic. The coins inside had settled into silence during the drive, their jingling optimism spent. Max rode shotgun, his nose leaving foggy prints on the window. The Labrador's usual golden sheen looked dull under the fluorescent lot lights, his fur still damp from the pre-dawn bath Margaret had given him. She'd brushed him until her wrists ached, working out every tangle, polishing his collar until the K9 insignia shone. This was his last day as county property, one way or another. The doors hissed open to reveal Chief Dawson holding a styrofoam cup of coffee, the steam curling around his tired face. His uniform was crisp, but his eyes were the same as at Samuel's funeral, that particular shade of exhausted grief reserved for men who'd lost too many under their command. He opened his mouth, then closed it when Max pushed past to stand at Ethan's side. the dog's shoulder brushing the boy's thigh in perfect sync. The auction hall smelled of lemon polish and stale donuts. Folding chairs faced a raised platform where the auctioneer tested his microphone, the feedback screech making several retirees wince. Margaret guided Ethan to a center aisle seat, her stomach lurching at the sight of James Blackwell already positioned near the front, his tailored suit costing more than her monthly mortgage. He was flanked by associates in matching elite security polos, their postures relaxed in the way of men who'd already won. Ethan's breathing hitched when Officer Murphy led Max onto the platform. The Labrador's nails clicked against the wooden stage, the sound echoing like a countdown. His training held even now, spine straight, ears forward, every muscle controlled despite the tremble Margaret could see rippling under his fur. Only his eyes betrayed him, darting again and again to Ethan as the boy's fingers tightened around the rocket ship Piggy bank. The auctioneer launched into his spiel, voice booming through tinny speakers. Lot 47, retired K9 Max, 7-year-old Labrador, certified in narcotics detection and tracking, current health records available. Paddles twitched around the room like nervous crickets. Opening bid at $5,000. Blackwell's paddle rose first. $5,000. His voice carried the bored confidence of someone buying a cup of coffee. Margaret's throat closed. Their GoFundMe, even with Wells's last-minute contribution, held barely $4,000. She reached for Ethan's hand, finding it clammy and rigid. The boy's lips moved soundlessly, his gaze locked on Max, who'd begun panting in short, sharp bursts. $6,000, called a voice from the back. Steve Wells stood leaning against the exit sign, his flannel shirt clashing with the corporate atmosphere. His calloused hands held no paddle, just a folded checkbook. The bidding war that followed unfolded like a slow-motion train wreck. Blackwell and Wells volleyed numbers back and forth, each escalation sucking more air from the room. At $20,000, the retirees stopped whispering. At $30,000, even the auctioneer's practiced cadence faltered. Margaret's vision tunneled, the numbers losing meaning as they climbed past anything she'd ever dreamed of affording. Ethan stood abruptly, the piggy bank slipping from his lap to shatter against the tile. Coins rolled in every direction, nickels spinning on their edges before wobbling to stillness. The sound froze the room, the final bid hanging at $45,000 from Blackwell, Wells hesitating for the first time. Then Ethan moved. Not toward the scattered coins, but straight for the stage. Max broke position immediately, his training collapsing as he strained against the leash. Officer Murphy, perhaps remembering another little boy who'd loved this dog, let the lead go slack just enough. Ethan climbed the steps with the solemnity of someone twice his age. The auctioneer stepped back, microphone dangling forgotten at his side. Even Blackwell leaned forward, his polished facade cracking with something almost like discomfort. When Ethan reached Max, he didn't throw his arms around the dog as Margaret expected. Instead, he reached beneath his shirt collar and pulled out his father's badge, the metal dull from years of small fingers worrying its surface. Max went utterly still. Then, with a precision that stole Margaret's breath, the Labrador sat at perfect attention, his nose inches from the badge, just as he'd done 1,000 times with Samuel. No one spoke. No one moved. The moment stretched thin enough to see through, to the years of silent car rides home from therapy, the nights Max had licked away nightmares, the way Ethan's first word after the mutism had been the dog's name whispered into fur at 2 a.m. Blackwell cleared his throat. $50,000, he said. But the number landed hollow. Wells was already moving down the aisle, his boots scuffing the polished floor. He didn't look at the auctioneer or Blackwell, just knelt to gather Ethan's scattered coins into his weathered palms. When he reached the stage, he pressed them into the boy's hands, then straightened. $60,000, Wells said, and the room exhaled all at once. The gavel fell before Blackwell could respond, the crack like a gunshot. Sold to bidder number 28. Margaret's knees gave out. She barely registered the chair catching her, the murmurs swelling around them. Blackwell's hissed conversation with his lawyers. The world narrowed to the sight of Ethan still standing on that stage, Max pressed against him like a second shadow, and Wells bending to attach a brand new leash to the dog's collar before placing the loop in Ethan's hand. Officer Murphy stepped forward with a clipboard. "Sign here for transfer paperwork," he told Wells, then hesitated before adding, "The department does require the new owner to—" "He's not the owner," Wells interrupted, nodding to Ethan. "I'm just the bank. The dog belongs to the boy." He scrawled his signature with a flourish. "Always has." The drive home passed in a blur. Max panted happily in the back seat, his head in Ethan's lap as the boy ran fingers through his fur with mechanical intensity, as if memorizing the texture. Margaret kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Blackwell's SUV chasing them down. But the only vehicle following was Wells' pickup, maintaining a respectful distance all the way to their driveway. He didn't come to the door when they arrived, just idled at the curb until Margaret waved, then pulled away with a salute. Inside, Max investigated every room like he'd never seen them before, sniffing corners, nudging toys with his nose, finally collapsing on Ethan's bed with a sigh that seemed to come from his paws. Ethan curled around him immediately, his face buried in the dog's side. Margaret stood in the doorway watching their ribs rise and fall in unison. The badge still hung around Ethan's neck, its metal warmed against Max's fur. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. Richard collecting the last of his things, probably. The sounds registered but didn't matter. Not with Max's tail thumping drowsily against the comforter. Not with Ethan's breathing already slowing into the first peaceful sleep he'd had in weeks. She closed the door softly and went to call Doctor Winters. The victory felt fragile still, the kind of happiness that made you hold your breath waiting for the other shoe to drop. But for now, in this moment, the house was whole again. The sheriff's department cruiser idled in the driveway at dawn, its light bar dark, but the engine running like a threat. Margaret watched through the kitchen blinds as Chief Dawson climbed out, his uniform hat tucked under one arm in what might have passed for deference if not for the set of his jaw. Behind him, Officer Murphy shifted uncomfortably, his boots scuffing the dewy grass. Max sensed them first. A low rumble built in the Labrador's chest where he lay sprawled across Ethan's feet at the breakfast table. The vibration traveled up the boy's legs, making his cereal spoon tremble against the bowl. Margaret opened the door before they could knock. The morning air smelled of cut grass and diesel exhaust, too bright and ordinary for the tension coiling between them. Dawson's gaze slid past her to where Max now stood at full alert, his body a golden barricade in front of Ethan. "Policy requires post-auction documentation." Dawson held out a clipboard thick with paperwork. The top sheet bore the department seal and the words, "Liability Waiver," in aggressive font. Vet records, proof of insurance, and quarterly behavioral evaluations for 12 months. The pages rustled as Margaret flipped through them. Each signature line glared accusingly, the fine print detailing all the ways Max could be confiscated if they failed to comply. Behind her, Ethan's chair scraped the floor as he pushed back from the table, his toast forgotten. Max didn't growl when Dawson reached to scan his microchip, but the Labrador's muscles quivered under his fur like live wires. The scanner beeped, confirming what everyone already knew. This dog's identity was still tied to the county's database, his ownership conditional at best. "One more thing." Dawson produced a sleek black harness from his cruiser. The police K9 patches had been removed, leaving ghostly outlines on the fabric. "Department property. We'll need it returned." Ethan moved then, so fast his chair toppled. He snatched the harness before Margaret could react, clutching it to his chest like something precious. His lips formed a word, "No," though no sound came out. The standoff stretched thin. Officer Murphy cleared his throat. "Chief, maybe we could—" "Policy's policy." Dawson's radio crackled with static, underscoring the finality. He held out his hand. Margaret expected tears, screaming. Instead, Ethan knelt and began unbuckling Max's current harness with methodical precision, his small fingers working the straps like he'd done it 1,000 times. The Labrador stood statue still, only his eyes moving between the boy and the officers. When the last buckle released, Max shook himself, his fur fluffing up in relief. Ethan folded the harness neatly before placing it in Dawson's waiting hand. Then, with a quiet certainty that made Murphy's breath catch, the boy reached up and unsnapped his father's badge from around his own neck. The metal gleamed as Ethan fastened it to Max's collar instead, the engraved numbers catching the light. Brownlee, 9472. A perfect fit. Dawson's throat worked. He looked at the badge, then at Ethan's resolute face, then at Margaret's trembling chin. For a heartbeat, the rigid set of his shoulders softened. Then his radio squawked again, and the moment shattered. "Paperwork's due by Friday," he muttered, retreating to the cruiser. Murphy lingered just long enough to squeeze Max's ear in silent farewell before following. The sound of the engine fading down the street left the house preternaturally quiet. Sunlight pooled on the linoleum where Max's harness had lain moments before. Ethan stood staring at the empty space, his hands flexing at his sides like they missed the weight of something. Margaret reached for him, but the boy dodged her grasp, bolting upstairs instead. Max hesitated only a second before giving chase, his nails skidding on the hardwood. The thump of Ethan's bedroom door shaking in its frame reverberated through the house. Margaret sagged against the counter, the paperwork blurring before her eyes. She'd expected bureaucracy, but not this. Not the way stripping Max of his vest had felt like peeling away another layer of Samuel. A crash from upstairs sent her racing. She found Ethan's room in chaos. The Lego city he'd painstakingly built over months lay in ruins, plastic shrapnel littering the carpet. The boy himself stood amid the wreckage, chest heaving, his face splotchy with silent tears. Max circled him anxiously, nudging at his clenched fists. Then Ethan did something he hadn't done since he was 4 years old. He screamed. The sound tore from his throat raw and jagged, bouncing off the walls like a living thing. Max immediately pressed closer, his body a warm barricade against the storm. Another scream followed, then another, each one louder than the last until Ethan collapsed against the dog, his small fists tangled in golden fur. Margaret knelt beside them, her own tears falling unchecked. She gathered them both, the trembling boy and the steadfast dog, and held on as the earthquake of grief shook through them. Outside, a mockingbird sang oblivious in the maple tree. The world kept turning. It took 23 minutes for Ethan to cry himself out. When the storm passed, he lay curled against Max's side, his breathing ragged but even. The Labrador licked salt from his forehead with gentle swipes, his tail thumping weakly, when Margaret stroked his ears. "Better?" she whispered. Ethan didn't speak, but he nodded against Max's fur, his fingers finding the badge on the dog's collar. The metal was warm from their shared heat, the engraving worn smooth by years of touch. Downstairs, the phone rang. Margaret let it go to voicemail, then tensed when Wells's gruff voice floated up the stairs. "Margaret, it's Steve. We need to talk about Blackwell. He's not done yet." The message ended with a click. Outside, the mockingbird fell silent. Somewhere in the house, a pipe groaned in the walls. Max's ear twitched at the sound, but he didn't lift his head from where it rested on Ethan's shoulder. Margaret exhaled slowly, her palm flat against Max's ribcage, feeling the steady thump of his heart. The paperwork on the kitchen counter waited like a time bomb. The harness in Dawson's cruiser was already being reassigned to another dog. The legal battle Wells hinted at loomed on the horizon. But here, now, in this sunlit patch of carpet with her son's breath evening out against golden fur, none of that mattered. They'd won the only battle that counted. For today, it was enough. The farmhouse porch light burned like a beacon in the gathering dusk, drawing Margaret's minivan up the gravel drive. Army crickets sawed their evening song through the tall grass as she parked beside Wells' battered pickup, its bed piled with hay bales and rusted tools. Max lifted his nose at the unfamiliar scents, damp earth, livestock, the faint metallic tang of well water, his ears swiveling toward the shadowy barn where a horse snorted. Wells emerged from the farmhouse before she could knock, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. The farmer looked older under the yellow porch light, the lines around his eyes carved deep as tractor furrows. He nodded at Max, then at Ethan dozing in the back seat, his face pressed against the window glass. "Leave the boy sleep. What I gotta show you ain't for kids." The farmhouse kitchen smelled of coffee and gun oil. Wells poured 2 mugs without asking, the steaming liquid black as the night outside. File folders covered the oak table, their edges curled with age. One lay open to reveal a coroner's report. Sarah Wells, age 24, seared, blunt force trauma, next to a photo of a smiling girl with a Labrador puppy in her lap. Margaret's fingers hovered over the image. "Your daughter was working at Meridian Pharmaceuticals when she found problems with their new painkiller." Wells tapped another file. Samuel's case notes from 3 years ago. Stamped inactive in red. "Your husband requested her whistleblower files the week before his crash." Max whined low in his throat, nosing at the folders. His tail stiffened when Wells produced a plastic evidence bag containing a shattered syringe. This is what they didn't want found. Batch XR9, the drug Max was trained to detect, causes liver failure in 1 out of 5 patients. The pieces clicked together. Blackwell's security contract with Meridian, his obsession with acquiring Max, the timing of Samuel's death. Margaret's mug clattered against the table. "They killed Samuel over this." Wells' jaw worked. "Ain't got proof yet." He slid a key across the table. "Barnloft's got everything we need. Max's nose is the missing piece." Outside, the barn loomed against the starless sky, its weathered boards groaning in the wind. The loft stairs creaked under their weight, each step releasing puffs of dust that glittered in Wells' flashlight beam. The space had been converted into a makeshift lab, chemical charts pinned to the rafters, microscopes on sawhorse tables, a corkboard threaded with red yarn, connecting photos over Sarah Silterer items. Max sneezed at the chemical smells, but moved with purpose, his nose working the air. Wells opened a steel locker revealing rows of identical vials. XR9 samples odd. Dollowens dog alerts positive. We got our link. Margaret hesitated. "This is evidence tampering. If Dawson finds out, he won't." Wells fitted Max with a modified K9 harness, the pockets bulging with recording equipment. "Dog's still county property till probation ends. Any alerts he makes are admissible." A floorboard squeaked below. Margaret froze as a shadow detached itself from the barn's lower level. Ethan, barefoot in pajamas, his eyes huge in the dim light. He scrambled up the ladder before she could stop him, rushing to Max's side. Wells muttered a curse, but the boy ignored him, his small hands checking the harness straps with expert touches. When he looked up at Margaret, his eyes held no surprise, only grim understanding. He'd known. Somehow he'd always known. Max licked Ethan's cheek, then turned to the chemical samples with military precision. His sniffing pattern was methodical, left to right, vial to vial, until he hit the 3rd row. The Labrador's entire body stiffened. A low growl rumbled through him as he backed away, his training overriding instinct to bark. Positive alert. Wells exhaled sharply. "Well, I'll be damned." He reached for the recording gear, but Ethan was faster, detaching the tiny camera with shaking fingers. The boy hugged it to his chest like a talisman, his gaze locking with Margaret's. In that moment, she saw Samuel staring back, the same stubborn set to the jaw, the same unspoken promise. This wasn't just about Max anymore. It never had been. Headlights swept across the barn walls. Wells cursed, killing the flashlight. Through the loft window, a black SUV rolled up the driveway, its plates obscured by mud. Blackwell. Margaret's pulse hammered in her throat as Max positioned himself between Ethan and the stairs, his lips peeling back to reveal white teeth. Wells shoved the evidence into a feed bag and thrust it at her. Take the boy and dog. Hide in the cornfield till I signal. Ethan didn't need telling twice. He grabbed Max's harness and vanished down the ladder with the Labrador at his heels, moving with the silent efficiency of kids who'd practiced hiding all their lives. The barn door creaked open below. Blackwell's voice carried up, slick as motor oil. "Steve? You home? Got some questions about that auction business?" Wells's boots thudded on the stairs. "Ain't you heard? I'm retired from answering questions." Margaret crouched in the corn rows, Ethan pressed against her side, Max's warm body sheltering them both. The boy's breath came in quick puffs against her arm, his fingers knotted in the dog's fur. Above them, the farmhouse lights blazed to life. Raised voices, the slam of a screen door. Max's ears pricked at a new sound, the distant wail of sirens. Wells must have called the state police. Ethan tensed, but Margaret held him tighter. They stayed frozen as tires spat gravel, as car doors slammed, as the sirens swelled and faded. Only when Wells' flashlight blinked 3 times from the porch did they emerge. The farmhouse kitchen now held 2 state troopers and a man in a suit with a badge that read AG Investigations. Blackwell was nowhere in sight. The agent accepted the camera from Ethan with solemn respect. "Son, your dog just helped shut down a $1 billion cover-up." He nodded at Max, then at the evidence bags. "We'll need official statements, but first..." His radio crackled. "Seems Chief Dawson wants a word about unauthorized K9 ops." Wells snorted. "Tell him to get in line behind Meridian's lawyers." The ride home passed in a blur of streetlights and radio static. Ethan slept against the window, his fingers still curled around Max's collar. The Labrador panted happily. His mission complete, his boy safe. Margaret kept one hand on the wheel and one on Samuel's badge where it gleamed against Max's fur. The night air rushing through the open windows smelled of rain and possibility. Somewhere ahead, Blackwell was scrambling. Dawson was fuming. Lawyers were drafting motions. But in this moment, with her son's quiet breathing and her husband's dog standing watch between them, the road stretched clear and open. The courthouse steps were colder than Margaret expected for May, the marble leaching chill through her thin soles as she climbed. Max's nails clicked a steady rhythm beside her, the Labrador's harness snug against his chest, where Samuel's badge caught the morning light. Ethan walked on the dog's other side, his small hand buried in golden fur, his eyes fixed on the revolving doors ahead. Inside, the air smelled of lemon polish and stale coffee. The elevator doors parted to reveal Chief Dawson waiting with 2 officers, their uniforms starched stiff as cardboard. His gaze dropped to Max, then to the badge on the dog's harness, his mouth tightening. "Conference room 3, was all he said before turning on his heel. The hearing room felt like a fishbowl, all glass walls and echoing acoustics. Margaret counted 17 people seated at the long oak table, state investigators, county commissioners, a stenographer with fingers poised over her machine. At the far end, Blackwell lounged like a bored panther, his lawyer whispering in his ear. The only empty chairs faced them all, nameplates marking where Brownlee family would sit. Max hesitated at the threshold, his nose working the air. Stress sweat, aftershave, the acrid tang of Blackwell's cigar lingering on wool. Ethan pressed closer to the dog, his free hand finding Margaret's. She squeezed back, feeling the boy's pulse flutter like a caged bird against her palm. "All rise." The state attorney general entered through a side door, her heels sharp against the tile. She carried no files, just a single sheet of paper that she placed carefully at the head of the table before taking her seat. The silence stretched taut. Then, movement at the back. Steve Wells limped in, his boots leaving mud streaks on the polished floor. He dropped into a chair against the wall, his presence drawing Blackwell's glare like a magnet. When Wells winked at Ethan, the boy actually smiled, a fleeting crack in his usual solemn mask. The AG steepled her fingers. "We're here to discuss 2 matters. First, Meridian Pharmaceuticals' falsified drug trials and their connection to Deputy Samuel Brownlee's death." A folder slid across the table. "Second, The unlawful seizure attempt of K9 Max by James Blackwell's security firm. Blackwell's lawyer shot up. My client denies all. Your client, the AG interrupted, paid 3 Meridian executives to falsify Max's service records last week. We have bank transfers. She tapped a recorder. And voicemails. The device played Blackwell's voice, tinny but clear. Get that damn dog before he alerts on the new batches? Ethan stiffened. Max whined low in his throat, nosing at the boy's pocket where the tiny camera from the barn still resided. Margaret watched realization dawn on Dawson's face, the chief's eyes darting between Max's harness and the evidence bags being unpacked by troopers. The AG continued. K9 Max's positive ID of XR9 samples links directly to documents found in Deputy Brownlee's cruiser after his death. We believe he was closing in on Meridian when they arranged the crash. A chair screeched. Blackwell was halfway to the door before 2 troopers blocked his path. His cufflinks flashed as he raised his hands in mock surrender. You've got nothing tying me to. Actually, the AG produced a final photo. Blackwell shaking hands with Meridian's CEO at a golf outing, dated 2 weeks before Samuel's crash. We do. The room erupted. Reporters surged forward. Dawson's coffee cup hit the floor with a ceramic crack. Through the chaos, Margaret saw Ethan slip from his chair to kneel beside Max, his lips moving in silent words only the dog could hear. The Labrador licked the boy's cheek, his tail thumping against the chair legs. When order was restored, the AG turned to Dawson. Chief, your department has a decision to make. K9 Max is material witness to a homicide. Where he's placed affects this case. Dawson's Adam's apple bobbed. His eyes found Ethan's small form curled against Max, the boy's fingers tracing the badge on the dog's collar. The chief reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a folded paper, the custody agreement Margaret had signed just weeks before. He tore it in half. Department policy, Dawson said gruffly, is to protect our own. That dog stays with the Brownlees. He tossed the pieces toward the AG. And somebody get that kid a soda. Christ. The gavel fell. Reporters scrambled. Blackwell was led out in cuffs, his snarl fading down the hallway. Through it all, Ethan remained frozen, his hands fisted in Max's fur like he feared the dog might vanish if he let go. Wells was the first to approach. He crouched until he was eye level with Ethan, his weathered face serious. Your daddy'd be proud, son. Both of you. He ruffled Max's ears before straightening to address Margaret. Paperwork's cleared. Dog's yours free and clear now. Dawson lingered as the room emptied, polishing his glasses with jerky motions. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible over the HVAC hum. He was my best. The chief nodded toward Max. Glad he's home where he belongs. Then he was gone too, leaving the 3 of them alone in the echoing chamber. Margaret, Ethan, and the dog that had brought them all back from the edge. The drive home was quiet. Ethan fell asleep against the window almost immediately, his exhaustion finally overtaking him. Max sprawled across the back seat, his head in the boy's lap, his breathing deep and even. Margaret kept glancing in the rear view, half expecting to see the nightmare restart. Blackwell's SUV, flashing lights, another summons. But the road behind remained empty, the afternoon sun painting everything gold. At home, Max investigated every room like he'd never seen them before, his nose checking corners, his tail wagging at familiar smells. Ethan trailed after him, their shadows merging on the hardwood. Margaret stood in the doorway watching them, the boy and his dog, the last survivors of a war they hadn't chosen. Outside, the maple tree Samuel had planted the summer before he died rustled in the breeze, its leaves whispering secrets only they could understand. She left the front door unlocked when she went inside. For the first time in years, it felt safe to. The morning of the fallen officer's memorial dawned clear and still, the kind of perfect spring day that made grief feel sharper by contrast. Margaret stood at Ethan's bedroom door, watching sunlight pool around the boy and dog, curled together on the rumpled sheets. Max's muzzle had gone nearly white in the year since the hearing, but his tail still thumped against the mattress when he noticed her, the movement jostling Ethan awake. The boy sat up, blinking, his hair sticking up in tufts, one hand automatically finding Max's ear. 3 months of speech therapy had given his voice back, though he still preferred silence most days. "Today's the ceremony," he said. Not a question, but an acknowledgement. Margaret nodded, holding out the small bundle she'd stayed up half the night preparing. The K9 vest, not the stripped-down harness Dawson had taken, but a new one she'd sewn herself from Samuel's old duty jacket. The fabric still smelled faintly of his aftershave when Ethan pressed it to his face. Max stood patiently as they fastened it, his chest expanding under the familiar weight. The Labrador seemed to understand this was no ordinary morning. His posture straightened, his ears pricked forward in what Margaret could only describe as pride. When Ethan clipped Samuel's badge to the front, the metal caught the light and threw prismed reflections across the walls, like scattered pieces of their old life finally falling into place. The memorial park buzzed with activity when they arrived. Dozens of officers milled near the granite monument, their dress blues pressed sharp, their shoes polished to mirrors. Chief Dawson stood at the podium adjusting his microphone, his gaze flickering to Margaret's group when they approached. Then the crowd parted. Whispers followed them down the aisle, not the pitying kind from funeral days, but something warmer, laced with respect. Officers reached out to touch Max's vest as they passed, their fingers brushing the badge like a talisman. Ethan walked straighter under the attention, his small shoulders squared, his grip on Max's leash loose and confident. Wells waited near the front row, his good flannel replaced by a suit that looked borrowed. He held 3 things: a photograph of Sarah, a single white rose, and a dog treat shaped like a bone. "For the hero," he murmured, offering it to Max. The Labrador accepted with gentle dignity, his tail sweeping Ethan's legs. When Dawson called Ethan's name, the boy didn't hesitate. He climbed the steps to the podium with Max at his side, the dog's nails clicking rhythmically against the stone. The microphone towered over him, its silver head tilted down like a curious bird. For a heartbeat, Margaret feared the silence would reclaim him. Then Max leaned against Ethan's leg, and the boy spoke. "My dad taught me heroes don't always win." His voice, still soft from disuse, carried across the hushed crowd. "Sometimes they just pass the torch." He unfastened Max's vest with practiced fingers, turning it to show the lining where Margaret had stitched Samuel's name and end of watch date. The Labrador stood motionless, his breathing even, his eyes fixed on some distant point only he could see. "Max is retiring for real now," Ethan continued. "But he's got one more job." He gestured to the side where a group of children sat in wheelchairs and walking braces, patients from the trauma ward they'd been visiting monthly. A girl with burn scars reached out instinctively, then paused, waiting for permission. Max crossed to her without being told, his tail wagging just enough to jingle the tags on his collar. When the girl buried her fingers in his fur, the dog sighed and leaned in, his whole body radiating calm. One by one, the other children approached, their laughter weaving through the somber air like sunlight through trees. Margaret watched Dawson wipe his eyes. She saw Wells nod to some private thought, but mostly she saw Ethan, her quiet, broken boy, standing tall as the children peppered him with questions. "How do you teach him to do that?" Ethan smiled, just a little. "Mostly you don't." He scratched Max's favorite spot between the shoulders. "You just love him and pay attention." Afterward, they drove to the cemetery, just the 3 of them. The grass around Samuel's headstone had grown thick and green, dotted with dandelions Ethan insisted they leave uncut because Dad liked yellow. Max sniffed the stone thoroughly before lying down in front of it, his chin resting on the granite base as if sharing secrets. Margaret placed the memorial program beside the flowers they'd brought. Ethan added his own offering, Max's old tennis ball, the one Samuel used to throw for hours in the backyard. The boy pressed his palm to the engraved dates, his lips moving in words too soft to hear. When they turned to go, Max stayed put. The Labrador looked at Ethan, then deliberately back at the grave, his meaning clear. "You want to stay with Dad a while?" Ethan asked. Max thumped his tail once in answer. They left him there, a golden sentinel in the afternoon light, his vest bright against the grass. Halfway down the hill, Margaret realized Ethan was crying, not the silent tears of before, but quiet, healing ones that streaked his face unchecked. She reached for his hand. He took it. The path ahead wound through dappled shade, their footsteps cushioned by pine needles. Somewhere behind them, a mockingbird sang. Somewhere ahead, the minivan waited with its doors still unlocked, the keys in the ignition, the whole wide world stretching out beyond the cemetery gates. Ethan squeezed her fingers. "Can we get Max a puppy?" Margaret laughed, the sound startling a flock of sparrows into flight. "We'll see," she said, and for the first time in years, she meant it.